An extract from Ballad of the Totems by Oodgeroo Noonuccal. My father was Noonuccal man and kept old tribal way. His totem was the carpet snake whom none must ever slay. But mother was of Pee-wee clan, and loudly she expressed the daring view that carpet snakes were nothing but a pest. Now one lived inside with us in full immunity, for no one dared to interfere with father's stern decree. A mighty fellow, 10 feet long, and as we lay in bed, we kids could watch him round a beam not far above our head. Oodgeroo Noonuccal was an Aboriginal activist who spent most of her early life growing up with racial discrimination. Throughout her childhood, not only her but her family were victims of racial discrimination occurring in Australian society. As a result of this trauma, it fueled Noonuccal with the power to stand for her people. Oodgeroo Noonuccal was born on the 3rd of November 1920. She was born in Minjerribah, also known as North Stradbroke Island, and originally given the name Kathleen Jean Mary Rusker. She didn't adopt the name Oodgeroo until 1988, with it meaning paperbark tree. She did it as a way of stripping the name given to her due to colonisation and to have a more traditional title. Her new name meaning Paperbook of the Noonuccal tribe, Oodgeroo Noonuccal. Her father was a Quandamuk man and part of the Noonuccal clan that was in North Stradbroke. Her mother had a Scottish father but an Aboriginal mother from inland Australia, who was from the Pee-wee clan. Her father was an Aboriginal activist as well, and at the time he was campaigning for better conditions between races. This left a strong impression on his daughter. In 1934, at the age of only 13, Oodgeroo finished her formal education at Dunwich State School. Given that it was the Depression era, she could not afford to gain further nursing training like her sisters had, and moved to Brisbane to look for work. Oodgeroo was not able to read or write, which left her limited career paths. Ultimately, she became a housemaid for local families. In 1942, at the age of 21, Oodgeroo enlisted into the Australian Women's Army Service to be able to continue her education and follow in her brother's footsteps, who had both been captured by the Japanese whilst enlisted in Singapore. She states, I joined the AWS principally because I did not accept fascism as a way of life. It was also a good opportunity for an Aboriginal to further their education. In fact, there were only 2 places where an Aboriginal could get an education, in jail or the army, and I didn't fancy jail. In the same year, Oodgeroo married her husband, Bruce Walker, and only a year later, Oodgeroo was forced to leave the army due to hearing loss from an ear infection. She returned to Brisbane and was able to train in secretarial skills under the Army's rehabilitation scheme. Not long after, the couple became interested in politics and joined the Communist Party of Australia, as it was the only political party at the time that did not support the White Australia policy. She became intrigued by the party and wanted to be a part of something that was going to create change for her and many other Indigenous Australians. Through the part, she gained skills in writing, public speaking, and political strategy. Her and her husband divorced not long before Oodgeroo gave birth to their son in 1946. Oodgeroo also gave birth to a second son in 1953. In the 1950s was also when she first became interested in poetry and began to become engaged and active with political activism, fighting for Aboriginal rights and social justice. Oodgeroo was an activist, poet, educator, and the first Aboriginal Australian to publish a book of verse. By the late 1950s, she had joined the Brisbane Realist Writers Group, with her contacts within the group encouraging her to publish her works. Her first collection was published in 1964, titled We Are Going. Oodgeroo was the first Indigenous Australian to have their poetry published and to great success. 10,000 copies of her collection were sold, and many are still sold annually today. The sales of Oodgeroo's poetry were ranked second only to Australia's best-selling poet C.J. Dennis. She continued to write poems that were very popular all over Australia and received many awards for her poetry, as well as her help within the Indigenous community and the constant effort in supporting peace between white and black Australians. She released a second collection titled The Dawn is at Hand in 1966 and a third in 1970 titled My People, a Kath Walker collection.
She won several literary awards including the Mary Gilmore Medal, the Jessie Litchfield Award and the Fellowship of Australian Writers Award. James Devaney, a writer as well, encouraged Noonuccal to send a selection of her poems to Dame Mary Gilmore. 94 at the time of their meeting, Gilmore said, as Noonuccal later recalled, "These belong to the world. Never forget you're the tool that wrote them down only." Amongst the 162 poems she wrote and published over her lifetime, the most famous and well-known are generally We Are Going, No More Boomerang, and Understand Old One. Each work speaks to the experiences and suffering of the Indigenous people. Each poem is a powerful political message as well as work in their own right. She is not solely remembered as a famous poet, as her work to increase Indigenous rights was tightly woven into her character as her poetry. Oodgeroo's first piece became an ode to the importance of Aboriginal Charter of Rights, in opposition to the Queensland Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders Act. For Oodgeroo, her poetry and future career was all a part of her constant activism to address the injustices delivered against the Indigenous peoples of Australia. Some had criticised her writings as acts of propaganda, to which Oodgeroo straightforwardly agreed that they were. Her poems were written in an effort to sway public opinion and provide a bolstering to fellow believers in Indigenous rights. In both her original poems and oral tradition of Indigenous stories, they act to reinforce and preserve Indigenous history and culture. The picture Oodgeroo Noonuccal paints in her poetry is often bleak, with people and place stolen away, just as was the Aboriginal land. To some, her presentation was almost weakening of the value of Indigenous people. But when considering the period that she was writing, it makes sense that her political poetry was there to sway opinions, reflecting the full grim picture of reality, focusing on suffering and grief to make abundantly clear the impacts of generations of oppression had on Indigenous Australians. While some of the works focused on bleakness, others were a plea, a demand for shared fellowship and equal rights. Chronologically, Noonuccal's books speak of the changing nature of Indigenous rights as the push towards fair representation continued. Each anthology provides an insight into the nature of the fight for equal rights and opportunities for Indigenous peoples from the 1960s to the 1990s. Indeed, during these 1960s, when her first poems were published, it was a perilous period for Indigenous Australians. The ramifications of speaking out and using her poetry in such a way could have been dangerous. Oodgeroo Noonuccal's work were defiant weapons against injustice. They were a way to keep the rightful place of the Indigenous peoples of Australia, despite opposition. More than anything, while her works were written with a precise aim in mind, the geniusness of the pieces were not just a stabbing at reality, but as with a good poetry, were also a way of translating feeling to page. Oodgeroo Noonuccal's poetry remains profound pieces of Australian literature, historically and socially. A clear call for justice and fairness from the moment they were written. Oodgeroo always wrote with a message in mind, expressed clearly on each page as another tool to push towards a brighter future for Australia. Of course, the scope of her poetry was undeniably part of a larger tapestry of genuinely exceptional women. One who took great strides to help advance the march towards equal rights for Indigenous Australians and Torres Strait Islanders. In 1961, Oodgeroo was elected as the Queensland State Secretary of the Federal Council for the Advancement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. She stayed in that position until 1970. The key idea of the group was to lead towards integration of Indigenous Australians rather than assimilation, and to improve their socio-economic standing. Due to this position and her fame with poetry, she achieved a high profile and became very popular throughout Australia. Oodgeroo fought for equality and campaigned for equal rights. She was also a member of the Queensland Aboriginal Advancement League, where she campaigned politicians for equal rights and social justice for the Indigenous peoples of Australia.
In 1967, a referendum was put forward to change the constitution to allow Aboriginal peoples to be included as part of the Australian census. Oodgeroo participated in many protests in favour of this referendum for Aboriginal people's suffrage, stressed the need for Aboriginal people to be consulted in policy decisions and their implementation, for them to gain full citizenship rights, and for the Commonwealth to have greater control over Aboriginal affairs, rather than by state or territory. While she was campaigning for the yes vote for the referendum, Oodgeroo and the Federal Council for the Advancement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders delegation met with Prime Minister Robert Menzies. The Prime Minister offered Oodgeroo a glass of sherry, and straight away Noonuccal informed the Prime Minister that he and his staff should be arrested, as it was currently illegal to offer Indigenous Australians alcohol. This small gesture is what challenged Menzies to rethink his views about Aboriginal people. The Federal Council for the Advancement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, that Oodgeroo was strongly a part of, also played a key role in gaining voting rights for Indigenous Australians, as well as Australian citizenship. Later, in 1969, Oodgeroo was invited to the World Council of Churches consultation on racism in London. She returned home to Australia with a newfound passion that Aboriginal activists need to work with their own political organisations rather than white-dominated ones. This caused her to eventually leave the Federal Council for the Advancement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders and join the newly formed Brisbane Aboriginal and Islanders Council and the National Tribal Council, where she became chairperson for a time. Not only is Noonuccal an activist, but an influencer to many at the time, working towards Aboriginal rights and equality. In 1971, she returned to Minjerribah in North Stradbroke Island, where she started a learning centre called Moongalba, which translates to the sitting down place. She became an educator and taught many visitors who came to the island about Aboriginal culture and country, and that the land ultimately belonged to Aboriginal people. She continued to publish books and poetry and did not stop campaigning for Aboriginal rights as well as the environment. Throughout the 1970s, Oodgeroo also travelled throughout Australia as well as internationally on lecture tours. In 1988, Oodgeroo Noonuccal returned the Member of the British Empire, or MBE, as a protest to the bicentennial celebration of White Australia. Oodgeroo had been awarded the MBE in 1970 for her services for the Aboriginal peoples of Australia. She stated that she'd only accepted the award in the first place after many Aboriginal people had insisted it would help break barriers that still continue to restrict Indigenous Australians. This rejection is also what prompted Oodgeroo to adopt the name Oodgeroo Noonuccal. She viewed the anniversary as 200 years of rape and carnage, and when asked, what is there to celebrate? On September 9, in 1993, at the age of 72, Oodgeroo Noonuccal passed away from cancer. Hundreds of people travelled to Minjerribah to remember and honour her life. Many people mourned her loss. However, she wanted them to celebrate her achievements and to continue to work for equality between all Australians, no matter what their skin, colour or background. The life and work of Oodgeroo Noonuccal will be felt throughout Australian history. She paved the way for Aboriginal activism, but also so that Indigenous Australians can undertake any career or way of life, same as their white counterparts. Being the first Aboriginal Australian to have published works of poetry, and for it to be such a phenomenal success, opened up many possibilities for Indigenous Australians. The teachings that Oodgeroo gave through her poems, stories, lectures, and so much more allowed Aboriginal history to be portrayed and remembered by many. The effort she undertook with her activism began the fight for social justice for Aboriginal Australians, the fight that's still going on today. But Oodgeroo Noonuccal challenged what it meant to be an Indigenous woman living in a colonised white society in a way that changed the path of Indigenous Australians forever.
We are going. They came into the little town, a semi-naked band, subdued and silent, all that remained of their tribe. They came here to the place of their old Burra ground, where now the many white men hurry about like ants. Notice of estate agents read, rubbish may be tipped here. Now it half covers the traces of the old Burra ring. They sit and are confused. They cannot say their thoughts. We are as strangers here now, but the white tribe are the strangers. We belong here. We are of the old ways. We are the corroboree and the bora ground. We are the old sacred ceremonies, the laws of the elders. We are the wonder tales of dream time, the tribal legends told. We are the past, the hunts and the laughing games and wandering campfires. We are the lightning bolt over Kapemba Hill, quick and terrible, and that thunderer after him, that loud fellow. We are the quiet daybreak, paling the dark lagoon. We are the shadow ghosts, creeping back as the campfires burn low. We are nature and the past, all the old ways gone now and scattered. The scrubs are gone, the hunting and the laughter. The eagle is gone. The emu and the kangaroo are gone from this place. The bora ring is gone. The corroboree is gone. And we are going.